41 years. That's how long a killer walked free, went grocery shopping, watched football games, probably complained about the weather, lived an ordinary life in a quiet state while a family in Colorado buried their daughter, then spent 4 decades standing at the edge of a courtroom that kept telling them, not yet. But here's the thing about time. It doesn't always protect the guilty. Sometimes it just delays justice. And when justice finally does arrive, it doesn't always come the way anyone expects. It doesn't always come from a breakthrough witness or a deathbed confession. Sometimes it comes from a trash can, from a discarded soda can on a Tuesday afternoon in Nebraska. This is the story of Sylvia May Quayle, a woman whose name a Colorado community refused to let die, and the extraordinary, almost cinematic chain of events that finally brought her killer to answer for what he did on a summer morning in 1981. Before we go any further, drop your location in the comments. We love hearing where our viewers are watching from, and if stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe. Every case we cover is someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone's unanswered question. Let's go back to the beginning. Cherry Hills Village, Colorado, sits about 7 miles south of downtown Denver, a leafy, well-manicured suburb where houses have wide driveways and the streets are quiet enough that you can hear your own footsteps. In 1981, it was exactly the kind of place where people moved to feel safe, where people left their cars unlocked and let their kids play outside until the sun went down. Sylvia May Quayle had built a quiet, purposeful life there. She was 34 years old, working as a secretary at an architecture firm, a job she didn't just show up to, but genuinely loved, partly because it connected her to a world she was passionate about. Her uncle, Wesley Quayle, was an architect, and Sylvia had spent years studying his work, poring over blueprints and project histories, the way other people lose themselves in novels. Architecture, for Sylvia, wasn't just a professional backdrop, it was personal. People who knew her, co-workers, neighbors, friends, all reach for the same kind of language when they describe her. Warm, energetic. The kind of person who made a room feel different the moment she stepped into it. She lived alone in her home on South Ogden Street, which by all accounts, she kept neat and full of life. August 4th, 1981, started like every other summer day in Cherry Hills Village, sunny, unhurried. The kind of Tuesday that Colorado does effortlessly. Blue skies, dry heat, nothing dramatic on the horizon. But inside that house on South Ogden Street, something terrible was happening. A man broke in. What followed was not chaotic or panicked, it was deliberate and savage. Sylvia was sexually assaulted. She was stabbed, repeatedly. And then, as a final act of brutality, she was shot once in the back of the head. The neighborhood outside remained undisturbed. Nobody heard anything. Nobody saw a stranger's car parked where it shouldn't have been. Nobody noticed anything wrong at all until Sylvia's father drove over to check on his daughter. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He let himself in. What he found on the living room floor, his daughter unclothed, her arms raised above her head, is the kind of image that doesn't leave a person. Not in a week. Not in 40 years. Not ever. He called the police. Within hours, Cherry Hills Village Police had called in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to take over the technical work. The crime scene was photographed, documented, and processed with everything 1981 had to offer. Evidence was cataloged and placed into storage. DNA samples were recovered from Sylvia's body and from multiple areas throughout the house. Here's the brutal irony of that moment. Investigators were holding the killer's biological fingerprint, literal cells he had left behind, and they couldn't do a single thing with it. DNA profiling as a forensic tool didn't exist yet. The double helix had been mapped decades earlier, but the technology to use genetic material for criminal identification was still years away. The FBI wouldn't begin building a national DNA database until the following decade. In 1981, having a DNA sample from a crime scene was like holding a key with no lock to put it in. So investigators did what they could. They interviewed neighbors. They tracked down men in the area who lacked solid alibis. They followed leads that surfaced in the days and weeks after the murder, names whispered by people who knew something or thought they might. Every thread was pulled. Every thread went nowhere. No matching fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. No one who could place a specific person inside that house at that specific time. The case file stayed open in the technical sense. Active was the word used on the paperwork, but in practice, the investigation had stalled. Detectives who had worked it rotated off to other cases, some retired, some transferred. The file moved from desk to desk until it settled into the kind of institutional limbo that law enforcement quietly refers to as a cold case. And there it sat, for almost 2 decades. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with an unsolved murder. It isn't static. It doesn't settle into acceptance the way other losses sometimes do. It loops, circling back every time the calendar hits a date, every time there's a news story about another family getting answers, every time the phone doesn't ring with an update. Sylvia's sister, Jo Hammett, lived inside that loop for 40 years. Jo called the detectives. She called when there was nothing new to report, and she called when she thought there should be. She showed up at press conferences even when the police department had very little to announce. She kept Sylvia's name in the conversation when everyone else had started to move on. On Sylvia's tombstone, the family had chosen an inscription, "Beauty seen is never lost." It was a tribute to who Sylvia had been, the woman who brightened rooms, who loved architecture and history, who was building a life in a quiet suburb 7 miles south of Denver. But that line also sat like a daily confrontation with the reality that her killer was somewhere out there, living freely, while the family's world had frozen in amber on August 4, 1981. Jo understood rationally that many cold cases are never solved. She wasn't naive about statistics or the limitations of a small department with limited resources. But understanding something intellectually is very different from accepting it emotionally, and Jo refused to accept it. She kept calling, she kept waiting, and eventually, science caught up. In 2013, the District Attorney's Office for Colorado's 18th Judicial District made a decision that would quietly change the outcome of dozens of old cases. They created a specialized cold case unit, not reactive, not waiting for new tips to come in, but proactive. A team whose entire purpose was to go back into the archives and ask, what can we do now that we couldn't do before? Sylvia May Quayle's case landed on their table early. Investigators pulled the original evidence from storage, the same biological samples that had been sitting untouched since 1981, the same DNA that had been submitted to the FBI's CODIS system in 2000, with no match. They examined everything with fresh eyes and made a critical decision: to try a technique that barely existed when CODIS came up empty. They partnered with a private company called United Data Connect, which specializes in a method called genetic genealogy or genetic family tree identification. The distinction between this and a traditional criminal DNA database search matters enormously, so here's how it works. CODIS, the FBI's national system, stores DNA profiles from convicted offenders. If the person who committed a crime was never convicted of something that triggered mandatory DNA collection, they aren't in there. The system searches only the people it already knows about. Genetic genealogy does something fundamentally different. It takes that same DNA sample and submits it not to a criminal database, but to the kind of public ancestry platforms where millions of ordinary people have voluntarily uploaded their genetic information. People trying to trace their family history, find distant relatives, or satisfy basic curiosity about where they come from. The logic is elegant. Even if the perpetrator himself has never submitted his DNA anywhere, there's a statistical probability that someone in his biological family has. A cousin, a great-niece, someone 3 branches away on a family tree who signed up for a genealogy kit and never thought twice about it. When the system finds those partial matches, genetic echoes of a shared ancestor, it gives investigators a starting point. Not an answer, but a direction. DNA from the 1981 crime scene was submitted to 2 public genealogy databases. And this time, after 40 years of silence, something came back. The results that returned weren't a name. They never are at first. What genetic genealogy produces in the early stages looks more like scattered puzzle pieces than a picture. Distant relatives, partial matches, people who share enough DNA to confirm a biological relationship somewhere in the family tree, but not close enough to point directly at a suspect. The experts at United Data Connect got to work. This part of the process is painstaking in a way that doesn't make for dramatic television but represents hundreds of hours of meticulous research. Genealogists begin cross-referencing genetic matches against publicly available records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, census data, obituaries, old newspaper announcements. Every branch of the family tree gets traced forward and backward. Every name that appears gets verified. The list of potential perpetrators started broad. Then it narrowed further until it produced a name. David Dwayne Anderson, 62 years old, living in Nebraska. Not a name anyone in Cherry Hills Village recognized. Not a name that appeared anywhere in the original case file from 1981 and 1982. Not an acquaintance of Sylvia's. Not someone her neighbors had ever seen. A complete stranger, at least as far as anyone could tell. But documents from the investigation's work also established something critical. Anderson had been in Colorado in 1981. He had been near Cherry Hills Village, near South Ogden Street, both before and after August 4th. The pieces were aligning. But alignment isn't evidence. To charge Anderson with murder, investigators needed something that would hold up in a courtroom. They needed a direct DNA comparison. His DNA, voluntarily or involuntarily collected, matched against the biological material left in Sylvia's home 41 years earlier. Getting it without tipping him off required patience. Investigators traveled to Nebraska. They didn't knock on David Dwayne Anderson's door. They didn't announce themselves. They simply watched. At some point, Anderson did what everyone does. He threw out his trash. And inside that trash bag, mixed in with whatever ordinary discards fill the bin of an ordinary man living an ordinary life, was a can of vanilla Coke. Finished, empty, tossed away without a second thought. Investigators retrieved it. The DNA extracted from the rim of that soda can, saliva from a man who had no idea he was being watched, was sent to the lab and compared against the samples collected from Sylvia Quayle's home in 1981. It matched. Not a partial match, not a consistent with qualifier. A direct match across multiple pieces of evidence collected from Sylvia's body and from her house on South Ogden Street. 40 years of anonymity ended by a discarded beverage. An arrest warrant was issued immediately. On February 10, 2021, David Dwayne Anderson was taken into custody in Nebraska and extradited to Colorado to face 2 counts of first-degree murder. When the news broke in Cherry Hills Village, the reaction was a specific kind of shock. Not just the shock of an arrest after 40 years, but the particular disorientation of learning that the answer had lived somewhere completely unexpected. Not a neighbor, not a local, not anyone the community had ever suspected or feared. A stranger from another state who had passed through in the summer of 1981 and left devastation behind. When investigators began tracing Anderson's history, what they found wasn't the profile of someone who had spent decades on the edge of the law. There were no dramatic red flags, no prior convictions that had somehow slipped through. To the people who had known him in Nebraska, he was unremarkable, a neighbor, an acquaintance, someone who didn't leave much of an impression. That particular detail is its own kind of disturbing. The deputy district attorney assigned to the case, Grant Grajiba, would later describe the crime as brutal and random language that carries a specific weight in criminal justice. Random means there was no prior relationship. No personal motive built on history between perpetrator and victim. It means Sylvia may have simply been in her home when a man made a decision to break in, and everything that followed flowed from that one moment of violence. Anderson had been in Colorado that summer. The evidence placed him near her neighborhood before and after August 4th. But why he was there, what brought him to Cherry Hills Village, what drew him to that specific house on South Ogden Street, those questions remain unanswered. Some questions, even solved cases, don't fully resolve. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and tried under the criminal statutes that were in effect in 1981, which is standard legal practice. You prosecute a crime under the laws that existed when it was committed. The first trial began in March 2022 at Arapahoe County Court. The prosecution laid out everything: the DNA chain, the genetic genealogy methodology, the family tree reconstruction, the vanilla Coke can. The jury deliberated for 5 days. They couldn't reach a verdict. Complete deadlock. Not enough consensus to convict. Not enough to acquit. The judge declared a mistrial. For Joe Hammett, for the Quayle family, for everyone who had waited 4 decades and thought the hardest part was finally over. It was a devastating setback. To have endured 40 years of silence and then to watch a jury walk out without an answer was its own particular cruelty. But the district attorney's office didn't fold. They refiled the charges the following month. A second jury was seated in June 2022. They heard the same evidence, the same DNA, the same story about a trash can in Nebraska and a soda can, and a man who had spent 4 decades living as though that August morning in 1981 had never happened. This time, the jury was not deadlocked. Guilty. On both counts of first-degree murder. Deputy District Attorney Grajiba stood outside the courthouse and delivered a line that landed with real weight. For more than 40 years, the defendant carried a dark secret. That secret was finally exposed in this trial. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for August 4, 2022. Exactly 41 years to the day after Sylvia's father walked into that house on South Ogden Street. That date was not accidental. Courts don't schedule things by coincidence when dates carry that kind of meaning. August 4th was chosen because everyone in that courtroom, the judge, the attorneys, the family, understood what it meant. David Dwayne Anderson was sentenced to life in prison. Because the case was prosecuted under 1981 law, he remains eligible for parole review after 20 years served, a provision that existed in the statutes at the time of the crime. Jo Hammett, who had spent 40 years calling detectives and refusing to let her sister's name be filed away into institutional forgetting, stood in that courtroom and said what she had been waiting to say for 4 decades. He needs to pay for what he did. And on August 4th, 2022, he finally began paying. Cherry Hills Village is still there. The streets are still tree-lined. The suburb is still quiet. The house on South Ogden Street still stands. The neighborhood that didn't hear anything on August 4th, 1981, has spent 4 decades living alongside an unsolved murder, and now knows an answer that came from a direction nobody anticipated. Sylvia May Quayle was 34 years old. She loved architecture and history. She had her uncle's blueprints and a job she cared about and a home she'd built for herself in a suburb 7 miles south of downtown Denver. People who knew her said she made rooms feel brighter. The inscription on her tombstone, "Beauty seen is never lost," was chosen to honor who she was before August 4th. But in the context of what her sister did for 40 years, it reads like something more. It reads like a promise, like a refusal to allow what happened to define the only version of Sylvia that gets remembered. This case teaches things worth carrying forward. It teaches that forensic science doesn't stop evolving, which means cold cases don't always stay cold. The DNA that sat useless in 1981 became decisive in 2021 because technology caught up. Evidence you collect today may solve a crime that hasn't happened yet. Evidence collected decades ago may still be waiting for the tool that finally makes it speak. It teaches that persistence is a form of justice work. Jo Hammett was not a detective. She had no forensic training, no institutional access, no special authority. What she had was a phone and a refusal to stop using it. Her 40 years of calls and appearances and pressure on a case that others had quietly shelved were not background noise. They were structural to how this case stayed alive long enough for technology to catch it. It teaches that genetic genealogy has fundamentally changed what a cold case means. Thousands of families across the country have evidence sitting in storage that was collected before this technology existed. The perpetrators in those cases are still out there. Some of them old now, some of them living quietly, some of them probably convinced they've gotten away with it. They may not have. Because all it takes is one distant relative uploading a DNA kit to Ancestry out of curiosity, and that chain of biological connection can lead investigators back. And finally, this case teaches something about what it means to say someone's name. Sylvia May Quayle. Say it, remember it. Community attention, the kind generated when people refuse to let a case be forgotten. When viewers watch videos like this one and share them and talk about them, is not peripheral to justice. It is part of the infrastructure of justice. Cases that stay in public consciousness stay on desks. They stay active. They stay alive long enough for a cold case unit to reopen them, for a genealogist to trace a family tree, for an investigator to wait outside an apartment building in Nebraska with a pair of gloves and a careful eye on the trash. Justice came for Sylvia Quayle 41 years late, but it came.